July of 1975, a boat captain perished off the coast of Amity Island. And one of the most tragic parts of that story is that it was completely preventable. It was preventable because had Quint, the fisherman, and the boat captain listened to what Brody had said, that they were going to need a bigger boat, he would have taken a different approach and would have been alive today. So I want to analyze that death. And from an established protocol that medical institutions use, it's known as morbidity and mortality conferences. Now, it's a lot like the aviation model, and that is that we're not looking to blame people. We want to improve aviation safety. And in order to do that, we want to encourage reporting. And the same thing applies in morbidity and mortality meetings and conferences. Because doctors make mistakes. Healthcare professionals make mistakes. We all make mistakes in a variety of ways. Of course, not all of those mistakes end up in fatalities. And oftentimes when you're dealing with a fatality or some type of disaster, it's actually a series of events that occur, and not as opposed to one-off incident. It's an awful lot like the Swiss cheese model that's used in aviation to describe the problem, is that a slice of Swiss cheese has several holes in it. And if you took like 5 slices of cheese and lined them all up, and the holes representing errors, then when they all lined up, then you've got your aviation disaster, or here we have a boat disaster. And I'm going to return to that analogy soon. But taking this analysis of the Quint death is that, you know, this was a few decades ago, obviously, perhaps 50 years ago, but nevertheless, there's a lot that we can learn from it. To begin with, one of the first problems that we learned about was the method of procuring the services. The government on Amity Island did a haphazard, half-assed job of advertising their needs. Now, in one way, the government tried to suppress the fact that there was a killer shark out there eating tourists. That just doesn't do well for the summer season. But at the same time, they had an obligation to get the right equipment, the right personnel, and for the job, and that was to capture and to kill the shark. So the way they first advertised it was actually a private advertisement from the mother of Alex Kidner. She posted a $3,000 bounty, which is about $18,000 today. And there was a meeting at Amity City Hall, and Quint showed up, and essentially, the deceased, and essentially said that, you know, I'll capture and kill this beast for $10,000. Now, he said he'd find it for 3, but capture and kill it for 10, and so that created an ambiguity. Was that like 10 plus 3? 10,000 plus 3,000? That's really 13,000? That was a little bit unclear. Now, of course, 3,000 today is back then was 18,000 today, so it's roughly about 6 times. So essentially, Quint was quoting $60,000 to capture and kill the shark. Now, the concern here, of course, is that he's never actually seen the shark. And as we find out later, that he actually found out it was a lot bigger than he thought. And so one of the first errors that was made in the Swiss cheese model was the government, and the failure to advertise it broadly, as opposed to getting a low-bid contractor that they found on the island. And that's the cost of silence, of cover-up, is, you know, you get what you pay for. So, so the procurement was an issue. And then the second error of many which occurred related to the actual equipment that was used. Now, for the type of shark that we later would find, is that the more appropriate type of vessel was essentially as big as a towboat, you know, a trawler, perhaps a fishing trawler, but it has a steel-plated hull. That's very important. Whereas with Quint, he had like a 1940s Nova Scotia wooden hull lobster boat. Now that, of course, we found out wasn't going to work. The other problem, of course, with that boat is that he claimed right at the procurement stage earlier that there's enough chiefs on the islands and he just wanted to do it by himself. Well, clearly he's writing checks with his mouth that his ass cannot cash. And so he shows up in this boat, this smaller boat. It's about a 42-footer. And the thing is, it's a single diesel engine. It's decades old. There's no indication of maintenance logs as to the problems which that had occurred over the course of the ship's use. We don't have any of that. We also have a situation in which there is no radio equipment on board. Now the reason why is because he smashed it, which relates to the personnel issue and what we can learn from that. But nevertheless, there was no radio equipment to communicate with the shore for more assistance. Secondly is that he did send out, he did respond that they were, fishing. It was a false message he was relaying to the chief's wife that they were just fishing. But if they never did show back up that evening, so one would have thought that they would have sent out a rescue. Nevertheless, so there's a communication breakdown with the equipment. Secondly is there's limited number of life vests, multiple OSHA violations here. Now he's probably got, there's a life vest for Hooper, there's a life vest for Brody, but there was no life vest for him. So that means that there were only perhaps maximum 2 life vests on board, and not enough for the number of personnel on board. So that raised concern. Moreover, the equipment itself is that the ship did not have any noticeable guardrails, and that when he before he slid into the shark's mouth and was eaten, is that perhaps if there were guardrails he could have hung on to, that would have prevented or at least slowed down the ability of the shark to eat him. The other thing is with that equipment is that if it was a steel hull ship, and it would have been a higher hull, whereas with the wooden, because it was a lobster boat, it had a lower hull which enabled the shark to get on board, which turned out to be, of course, tragic. The other problem that presented itself in a different category was personnel, is that he had first indicated it was just going to be him. That was just a bad idea, particularly in light of the size of the shark. Look how Ben Gardner did. I made a video about that. The outcome for Ben was not very good either. Kind of lost his head over it, looks like. But here we have Brody on board. Brody was the police chief, and he was afraid of the water. So that was a poor selection as far as a shipmate, a personnel. Secondly is that Hooper was an able seaman. He had a background in oceanography, he was a researcher, but he was not in the business of hunting big game, so to speak. So, I mean, between the two, of course, Hooper was certainly the better choice than Brody. Now, turning to Quint here, now usually with this M&M, the Morbidity and Mortality Conference, we would have Quint testify to the committee about some of the errors that he made, where he could improve. Now it's difficult because he's already been digested by the shark and eliminated at the end, I guess. So I think perhaps the only way that we'd really be able to contact Quint is through a Ouija board, to be able to summon the dead perhaps. He may not want to talk, he may refuse to talk, but if we could summon the spirits, so to speak, I think that would be beneficial for learning purposes, which is the whole purpose, because it's M&Ms, just like the aviation model, are not about blame. If we took perhaps a different approach, a deadly force analysis, we could perhaps apply that to the fish, the shark. Was it necessary for the shark to eat Quint? We would probably find the shark would end up being found liable for that. But this is not about blame. This is more about learning. Now, the other thing, too, is about Quint is that he had suffered from PTSD, given his experience on the USS Indianapolis, where an awful lot of his shipmates ended up being eaten by sharks. Now, this, of course, was not disclosed until he was on board. It was at least a couple days on board before he disclosed that, and only after drinking. And so that was unfortunate, of course, for the participants, and it was too late for them to turn around. And in fact, when Brody pointed out that we're going to need a bigger boat, that was really an ideal time, perhaps, for Quint to decide that we're going down the wrong road. And when you go down the wrong road, it just doesn't get any better. And so they should have turned around. That would have been a good idea. Now, the other thing is with Quint is that what we learned is that he created a toxic work environment. He yelled, he used profanity. So as far as from HR standards, this of course would create its own issues. But he did not entertain alternatives. He took very much of an authoritarian type of approach. Now, you should only have one captain on per boat, but there was really no game plan about this. There was no discussion about what would happen in the event that he became incapacitated, for example, bitten off below the waist. But so there was a lot of planning that could have occurred, and it could have been participatory. He would ultimately have been the final decision maker, of course, being on a boat, because you don't want to have, you don't want too many chefs in the kitchen, you don't want more than one captain on the boat. But that's something that I think that he could have been open to. That would have resulted in, I think, better outcomes. So in the end, what have we learned? We learned that obviously multiple errors were made. And there are probably additional errors we can point out in this analysis, and that might require a follow-up presentation. But we do see that an awful lot of errors, just like in the Swiss cheese model, those slices of cheese lined up and created the disaster, which ultimately resulted in Quint's death. Now, one could say that those 5 slices of cheese representing all those errors could be made into a sandwich, a fish sandwich, but the type of sandwich that the fish ended up eating because of all those errors. Ultimately, the fish did benefit a significant amount. In the end, however, the fish was blown up, so there's certainly a lot of blame to go around. Certainly there was more than one death from that expedition. There's Quint's and then the sharks. We don't have the ability to hear from the shark at this time. Even if we had a Ouija board communication style, I'm not sure that we're at the capability, even with AI, of understanding fish talk or fish communication. So that could create its own issues. But nevertheless, I think that the solid takeaway here from this analysis about how we can prevent this in the future is that don't bite off more than you can chew. I think that's the essential takeaway, and that if Quint had abided by that, he'd still be alive today. I hope this helps. I hope this prevents deaths in the future, particularly when engaging in such dangerous activities as hunting a 25-foot plus 3-ton shark. So I hope this ultimately, this M&M conference that we've had has been helpful. It can help prevent future deaths in similar circumstances. So here's to good fishing. I'm Dr. Z, and this is Humor in Darkness.